Now welcome to the stage, Joe Weinman.
So this is the closing keynote. Thank you so much for hanging in there. Our closing keynote is a man who needs no introduction. But hang on, maybe I should say a few words. So this is the perfect closing keynote for this event because this is the man who co-founded, you could say, or was one of the fathers of the internet. And so as preparation for introducing him, I did start using the internet last week, and it's pretty good. I don't know who's used it, but I like it a lot. So of course it permeates every dimension of our society and civilization. And this is a person who I'm sure didn't completely foresee Snapchat or locked iPhones or 5G when he was busy designing or co-designing protocols. But it's amazing how prescient he was. He saw the convergence of computing and communications. He saw the rise of connected things. And so what a great keynote to sort of put a closing period on the first 40 years of PTC, and you could say modern digital society as we know it, and to help predict what the next 40 years will bring. I just want to relate one quick anecdote, and then you don't want to hear me, you want to hear him. But some of you may know that he's been at Google for a while now. Astounding to me is that it's been 13 years. And of course, just like any other potential employee, he had to interview. And of course, Google, at least 13 years ago, and maybe still today, is mostly 20-somethings. And so he filled out his application, and it was kind of, what was your Stanford GPA? And kind of went through the process and said, well, do you want to know anything that I did after Stanford? Because he accomplished just a few things. So without further ado, please join me in giving a super warm welcome to arguably the reason we're all here today, Vint Cerf.
So we got music. Am I supposed to, right. So, aloha, hawale makahikiho. That's all Hawaiian you're going to get out of me this morning. I'm going to try to take you 40 years back and 40 years ahead to see what might become of the internet. But before I do that, I want to say a thank you, first of all, to those of you who actually stayed all the way to the end. That's pretty impressive, given the attractive beaches out there. But the other thank you goes to the consequences of what many of you have been doing this week and many, many weeks before in the years ago, and that's making infrastructure happen that carries the internet packets across the oceans, across the continents, and over the satellites. So we have satellite, undersea cable, mobile towers, radio, and everything else, and a lot of what goes on here at PTC increases the availability of those facilities and in many cases reduces their cost, and that makes a huge difference for those of us who are trying to build more applications on top of the internet. But let me take you back to 1969, almost 50 years ago. God, I hate numbers like that. When the Arpanet Experiment was underway. This is a military funded, DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Agency, funded project to figure out whether packet switching would work. So we built a small 4-node network using little computers called IMPs, Interface Message Processors, to build a subnet, and then we connected some time-shared machines to them. So I was a graduate student at UCLA writing the software for the Sigma 7 machine to connect it to the first IMP installed in September of 1969. The Sigma 7's in a museum somewhere. Some people think I should be there too, but I'm here. So that's the early origins of packet switching. And let's look and see a little bit further now. Bob Kahn, my partner in the design of internet, came to visit me at Stanford in 1973 and said, we have a problem. And of course, my first reaction was, what do you mean we? He said, well, we've got this Arpanet and it works. The Defense Department wants to use computers in command and control. but they know that means they're going to have to put the computers in airplanes and ships at sea and mobile vehicles, as well as fixed installations. Can't use wires to hook up the planes because they can't take off and the ships get all tangled up. So we had to use satellite and radio. So he had developed a packet-switched mobile radio system, which we put into the San Francisco Bay Area. And in addition to that, a satellite system using Intelsat 4A over the Atlantic, all packets switched. So it was like an Ethernet in the sky. So we had these three different networks, Arpanet, the mobile radio network, and the packet satellite net, in addition to which in '73, some of you will remember that Bob Metcalf and David Boggs invented Ethernet at Xerox PARC, which is about 1.5 miles from my lab at Stanford. So we had 4 different kinds of networks that were doing packet switching. The question was, how do we get them all to look like it's one uniform thing? And that's the thing that Bob and I worked on for about 6 months, from spring of '73 to the fall of '73. Wrote a paper published in 1974 to describe for the general public, at least for the researchers, what the internet looked like. A few years later, we got to the point where we could test all 3 of those networks. So this was the first test, November 22nd, 1977, of all 3 networks being interconnected. We had a mobile radio van running up and down the Bayshore Freeway, radiating packets going into a gateway that went into the Arpanet, went all the way across the Arpanet to Norway and then down to London. It popped out of the Arpanet at that point and went through a gateway into the packet satellite net, came all the way back down to Etam, West Virginia by satellite, and then went back into the Arpanet with another gateway all the way across the country to USC ISI, Information Sciences Institute, in Los Angeles. So there's about 400 miles between the mobile van up in San Francisco and the USC facility in Marina del Rey. But the packets went 100,000 miles because they went over 2 satellite hops back and forth across the Atlantic and the United States. So by the time all that had happened, it actually worked. I remember jumping up and down saying, it works, it's like it's a miracle. It's a miracle when software works. I think everybody agrees with that. So this was a very important milestone from my point of view. Then the National Science Foundation saw the potential in using packet switching to link a bunch of universities, about 3,000 of them together. And so in the mid-1980s, they funded the development of what they call the NSFNet backbone. In parallel with that, the Department of Energy and NASA also built national scale backbones. NSF in particular not only built about 12 regional networks plus a backbone network, but they also invested in international connections to countries all around the world that also had research and engineering networks that were under development. And some of you who are familiar with the stories of connectivity in the Pacific Islands, for example, or with the Pacific Rim, will know that the International Connections Program made a huge difference to link many of the academic research networks together all the way across the globe. So NSF gets enormous credit for what it did. Interestingly enough, they shut their network down in 1995 after 10 years of operation. Why would they do that? Well, part of the answer is you people, because the commercial sector had picked up, starting in 1989, the implementation of commercial internet service. And I can remember we had to break a certain policy barrier to do that. In 1988, only research network traffic was allowed on these government backbones. So I got permission in '88 from the Federal Networking Council to connect MCI mail up to the internet as a test, but that meant that there was commercial traffic flowing over the government-sponsored backbones. And of course that demonstrated to the private sector that there was actually a market for internet service. And indeed by '95, we didn't need the special purpose backbone anymore, and NSFNet was shut down. So, of course, this is what the internet looks like today, and this is a gigantic global thing. About 50% of the world's population is online, and I show you this picture with all the colors just to emphasize the fact that it's not centrally controlled. It's a highly distributed system. No one is told with whom they should connect. No one is told which equipment to use. No one is told which software to use. They all commit to using the standardized protocols, TCP/IP and others, many others, including the World Wide Web. protocols, and it's the protocols that make this stuff interwork. So it's a highly distributed, very, very independent system, and it continues to grow to this day, partly in thanks to what you do. So where are we now? Well, the world's population is 7.6 billion now. Internet's about half of that, although I always wonder, whether these numbers are not quite right, because there are so many people with smartphones today that anyone with a smartphone, in theory, has access to the internet. So perhaps this is a low figure at 50%. The smartphone population at 2.5 billion let's say for next year, is still only about a third of the total world's population. All the other phones are simpler, feature phones or less. And nobody knows how many servers there are on the internet. I've given up trying to do any calculations at all. In terms of the capacity to do things, in earlier sessions today, there was reference to large-scale cloud systems, which, as you all know, have been growing very rapidly. Many companies, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and others. We had a particularly large job run recently by Andrew Sutherland at MIT, 580,000 cores running all on the same problem. And I'll be honest, I don't remember what the Sato-Tate conjecture is, but if you Google that, I'm sure that you'll get some good information. And then finally, data never sleeps, so we have another. This is an example of what does a day look like on the internet. You can see some of these statistics. They're pretty incredible. I'm not going to walk my way through them. You can read them all. The point here is that people are making use of the communications capability that the internet offers in a wide range of ways, and they keep inventing new ones. And I don't think I could overemphasize how important it is that this architecture has been made so open. If you don't like the protocols that are available, you're welcome to build some more. It's hard to change the internet layer of protocol. The IP layer is sort of right down there at the core. Some of you know that there has been a real struggle to get IP version 6 in place in parallel with IP version 4. This is one of those miscalculations that it's a little embarrassing. But in 1973, Bob and I were trying to figure out how many terminations should we design into the internet. And so we started out on the presumption that every country should have at least 2 networks, so there'd be some competition. After all, we just finished the Arpanet, and that was a fairly significant challenge to get one national scale network built. So we thought, okay, so 2 networks per country. How many countries were there? And there wasn't any Google to ask, so we guessed at 128, because that was a power of 2, and that's what programmers think in. So 2 times 128 is 256. And we said, how many computers will be attached to each network? And at that time, the computers were big time-shared machines that were in air-conditioned buildings, and they didn't move around. So we said, well, how about 24 million? That's, 2 to the 24th. So we have 16 million, I'm sorry, I'm doing the math wrong. So 16 million computers and 256 networks, that's 32 bits of address space. If it were really full, it'd be 4.3 billion terminations. And we thought in 1973 that ought to be enough. It was certainly enough for an experiment. And I actually thought that if the experiment succeeded, that we would then build a production version of the internet. But the experiment escaped around 1989, and it became part of this global thing. So here we are, it's 2018, and we really need IPv6. So those of you who have any finger on a button that will make more IPv6 happen, please do that, so we can support more of this growth. Now, the rest of the slides are not nearly as colorful as the first few were, but I want you, please, to think about what you're seeing here and what I'm telling you. There is a huge amount of work ahead of us, and that work will continue for the 40 years that I can foresee. And the reason is that there are all kinds of dangling participles associated with the current internet's implementation and use. So, first thing that we've learned, partly out of our experience at the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, is that if you're going to make policy, you should really get all the people who are going to be affected by that policy to weigh in on what that policy is, to have some idea of what the side effects are of policy choices. Now, after the policy is agreed, it may very well be that a much smaller group is responsible for enforcing the policy. So I want to make that distinction. But the creation of policy in a multi-stakeholder way is really important. And policy for the internet has, in general, been a very open process in all of its history. Another thing which I imagine that every one of you would agree with is that in today's internet, we are lacking safety, security, privacy, reliability, interoperability, and connectedness. We are actually seeing some fragmentation happening as a result of national decisions to filter and block, commercial incentives to interfere with communications and connectivity. We will not benefit from the internet if we don't solve some of these problems. And some of these are technical, but some of them are legal. They may involve transnational agreements among countries. They may involve bilateral and multilateral agreements. They're going to have to involve societal decisions too. Anyone who's been watching fake news and misinformation and other kinds of things that are happening on the internet today will recognize that these are societal issues, and they cannot be solved solely by legislation and law enforcement. In part, they have to be solved in the wetware up here. So this is a big challenge because human beings are lazy. People don't always want to think about what they're seeing and hearing, and I'm here to tell you, we have to start thinking about where did this information come from, who supplied it, what motivations might have been behind a particular piece of information that's offered on the net. We are going to have to teach ourselves as a society to be critical thinkers. Otherwise, this plethora of mixed content, good and bad, will simply lead to confusion. So we have some serious work to do. As I say, I'm not going to go through every single one of these things, but you can get a sense for the amount of work that's still needed to make this internet happen. Now, there's another thing which I believe is equally important. It's one thing to build infrastructure. It's one thing to get the undersea cables in place, to get radio towers done, satellites in place, physical equipment, internet exchange facilities, and things like that. But it's something else to actually put all that infrastructure to work. And that's the thing which I want to focus on, at least in this slide, and that's to pay attention to the people who are using these facilities, who create products and services on them, who consume the content that's on the net, make use of it in order to transact business or to carry out their daily lives. And so from that point of view, the objective needs to be making the internet affordable and accessible and filled with useful content. So it doesn't do me much good if I'm in Bogota looking for a plumber and all I can find is the plumber in New York City. So we really have to think about encouraging local content and in local languages to make this thing really useful. It's also very important that where the internet is not, to create incentives for investment in it. You heard in one of the earlier panels today about capital formation being a very important part of the activity that goes on to create this infrastructure. So we need policy in each country that will encourage private sector investment and will encourage competition, which in theory should drive cost out and improve quality of service, and of course choices for users like you and me. Another thing which I think is inescapable is that the network can be part of education and healthcare, network facilitated work, people that can work from home, people that can work from virtually anywhere. And I also think for small countries especially that are trying to build GDP per capita, creating products and services that are useful not only in their domestic economies but also useful in other parts of the world is a very important objective because the world's economy is bigger than any one country's economy. So creating products and services that speak to the world has to be a smart move for almost everyone. There are still places in the world where the internet hasn't gone, and I, like many others, I rely on people like you to change that equation. And one other thing I would point out is that if there is an attempt to create internet facilities somewhere, that you can't just parachute in, put stuff in place, and leave. One of my very close friends, Steve Hooter, who is regularly here at this conference, I guess he's left to go back to San Francisco, runs the Network Startup Resources Center, and his idea is you show up with respect to the people that you're trying to help get the internet up. You teach them everything you can, you provide them with documentation and equipment, and don't leave until you're pretty sure that they can run the internet on their own and expand it. That's the attitude we should have everywhere that we go. There's still a lot of technical work to be done on the internet. Some of you, I'm sure, have your fingers in that pie as well. We need, I know, the wonderful thing about standards is we have so many of them. But the answer is we really do need more standards for the various things that the network is attempting to do, or the people are attempting to do with the internet. There are lots of different organizations that create standards. Some you know, IETF, of course, for the core protocols, the World Wide Web Consortium for the layers above the World Wide Web, but IEEE and ITU and others. Those standards are wonderful substitutes for millions of pairwise agreements. Because if everybody agrees to implement a particular standard, now you don't have to debate and negotiate. You know that it should work if you've all implemented the same thing. So I'm very interested in making sure that we have standards to make the network function. We're going to need reliable and updatable software. This is particularly important with the Internet of Things coming. I'm sure you appreciate that nobody knows how to write software that doesn't have bugs. And so that means that we'll be surrounded by millions of devices with software in them, much of which may be buggy and which needs to be fixed. So the question is, will the software be available? Who will make it? How will it get loaded into that device? How will the device know where that came from? How will they know that that software is legitimate as opposed to somebody's malware hack? There are a whole bunch of problems of authenticity and integrity that need to be solved, and that all has to be built in to the ecosystem of the Internet of Things, and more generally, the ecosystem of all the devices that are part of the Internet. So I'm a big fan of very strong end-to-end authentication, the use of strong cryptography in order to protect confidentiality, and clearly, again, IPv6 address implementation so that we can deal with the billions of devices still to come. Now, I have another rant, which I would spend another half hour on, but I just want to remind you of something. Many people feel that bits are somehow immortal because they don't necessarily, they're these ethereal things. But you and I both know that the bits actually are implemented in physical media. They may be magnetic media, they may be optical media, and those bits may not last forever. I don't know about you, but I still have a few 5 1/4-inch floppy disks down in my basement, but I don't have a reader that can read them. And I have some 3 1/2-inch floppies, and I found a reader on eBay which plugged into a USB on my Mac. So I said, well, that's interesting. So I plugged in this little 3 1/2-inch floppy, and it read the files, and I discovered WordPerfect files, which I didn't have running on the Mac because I didn't have a WordPerfect word processor. So I have the files, but I don't have the processor that goes with it, which raises a very interesting problem. And that's, how long is digital content that you and I create going to last in a useful way? Will it be available to our descendants 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now? So there's this long rant, which I won't go into, but I am very, very worried that we do not have in place practices and procedures and even legal authorities to run old software and share that with other people in order to keep digital content useful and accessible over really long periods of time. I'm imagining that people in the 22nd century are going to wonder about us in the 21st. They won't be able to find our tweets and our emails. Maybe that's a good thing. And among other things, what about all the photographs that we take? They have a certain format. What if that format isn't known anymore 100 years from now? I have real photographs, physical photographs, that I know to be 150 years old. And so when people ask me, what should I do with my digital pictures that I care about? I tell them, find some good quality photographic paper and print it, because I know that lasts for 150 years, and I cannot tell you anything about the digital formats and the digital media that those pictures are installed on. One other worry that I have is identification, not of persons, but of things on the net, content. Think about the domain name system and URLs as you see them today. The papers that you heard during this conference and the ones that are, I want to say, printed in the proceedings, but they're probably in digital form. But there are all those URL references. You see them all the time. And then you realize that URLs are not necessarily stable, because the domain names behind them may not resolve anymore because somebody forgot to pay the rent. So papers from 50 years from now, papers from today, may have references in them that we can't get access to because the URLs don't resolve. Now, there's a guy out in San Francisco, Brewster Kahle, who's running the Internet Archive. He is actually trying to copy the World Wide Web. He doesn't have enough memory to do that, but he's trying hard to keep as much as he can. And it's an attempt, but we are going to have to find more stable identifiers in order to make sure that the references that we make are resolvable 10, 50, and 100 years from now. And I think, of course, there's still more broadband to be implemented, both on wired and wireless access modes. I think I'm getting close to I'm almost out of time anyway. In terms of other things that we should be concerned about and will be working on over the next decades to come, the Internet of Things is pretty obvious. Lots of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And again, that mantra, reliability, safety, privacy, security, interoperability, and autonomy. On the autonomy part, nobody wants a house that doesn't work when the internet connection breaks. Okay, so you have to have this Internet of Things that works on their own autonomously, even if the internet access is not available. It may make them more useful to be connected to the internet, but you want a house that works regardless of that. I am, as many of you must be, worried about all the misinformation and disinformation. I've already made that point. I'm still worried about that. The malware and the buggy software. One thing we could use is smart compilers that will call attention to the programmers to mistakes that they are about to make. For example, you just created a buffer overflow, or you just made a reference to a variable that hasn't been set, and so the value you're going to get is a random number. We are going to need more help, and maybe machine learning and artificial intelligence will help programmers do a better job of writing software that doesn't have bugs, because otherwise we're just going to be surrounded by buggy software for the rest of our lives. Self-driving cars, self-driving drones, and robotics are all examples of artificial intelligence, and they are also examples of what could possibly go wrong in the event that the software doesn't work right. Which leads me to one very important point. If you happen to be in the software business, if you're responsible for writing software, I would argue that you have a very deep and heavy responsibility to try to make that software work as advertised, to make it free of bugs. That's an ethical demand, I think. In the past, that might not have been quite so serious because the software didn't necessarily do things that people depended on. But today we are so dependent, our ecosystem is so dependent on reliable software that a programmer really should feel a great deal of pressure to avoid making mistakes. And that leads to digital literacy, which is, I think it's a term that could be defined in many ways, but from my point of view, it is understanding the nature of digital environments, including the fact that software is buggy. It's sort of like teaching your kids to look both ways before they cross the street. We should be anticipating that the things that have software in them are not always going to work the way we expect. We should be prepared for that. That's part of what I think digital literacy is all about. If we want to look farther out into the future, many of you know that I've been working since '98 on an interplanetary extension of the internet, and that is in fact in operation now. Between Earth and Mars and the International Space Station, we're running standardized interplanetary protocols, gathering all the data from Mars in particular to come back here to Earth since 2004. We are looking now at an interstellar mission to Alpha Centauri. One of the targets is to try to get there in 100 elapsed years, which is going to require better rocket propulsion than we have today. Right now, today's rockets would take us about 76,000 years to get to Alpha Centauri. which is a little long, even for an ARPA project. So that's going to have to change. We're probably going to end up having to find ion engines that will propel us up to about 10 to 15, maybe 20% the speed of light. And then we'll have to slow down. Otherwise, we'll go through the Alpha Centauri system and get one picture, and that's it. One of the big problems I'm worried about is how to communicate from Alpha Centauri back. How do you generate a signal that you could pick up from 4 light years away? That's a non-trivial problem. Probably a femtosecond or attosecond pulse laser could produce a significantly high power signal that you could pick it up. The trouble is there's going to be beam spread. And so this interplanetary backbone that we're currently trying to deploy over the next several decades will be needed in order to build a synthetic aperture receiver to reintegrate the signal coming from Alpha Centauri, because the signal will have beam spread and it'll be a very weak signal indeed. I think you can anticipate that connectivity, internet connectivity, will be ambient. It will be mostly radio, but no matter where you go, you will be online, able to get access to the net. And I think also you'll find that a great deal of the software that we use will have this augmentation to make us smarter, allow us to make use of computing capabilities to do things we couldn't do ourselves. We couldn't do a Google search on our own. There's too much stuff out there. It would take too long. The computers make that easy for us. And yet we're still the ones that are doing the querying, so we're still in control of that. I'm hoping that Brewster Kahl's project will turn into a self-archiving World Wide Web, something that will actually capture the data and solve the problem of the unresolved references that I mentioned earlier. It's very clear that augmented reality is on its way, and I'm sure during this 40-year period that we're looking at towards the future, that will be the norm, that knowledge about the world around us will be presented to us while we're wearing our augmented reality glasses. And I do hope that it looks like glasses, because if it looks like the virtual reality stuff that you see today, everybody looks like Darth Vader, and it's just weird. I don't know how you do video conferencing wearing those things, because if you had a camera showing you, you'd look like Darth Vader, and you don't want to look like that. So somebody is going to have to make a business out of creating an avatar for you in your, so that when you're wearing your virtual reality headset, that you look like you, and of course you'll be able to pay for airbrushing and improvement, get some hair, things like that. And finally, last point, and I realize I'm over time, is this collaborative virtual environment notion. I'm convinced, having just seen simple examples of collaboration in the Google space using Google Docs and Google video conferencing, where we are together working on the same object, modifying it at the same time, whether it's a document or a spreadsheet or a presentation. The fact that multiple parties can be doing things to those documents while they're talking about it and arguing is a small example of a collaborative environment. And I found this to be astonishingly effective, in some ways more effective than sitting around a table with a piece of paper, because of the flexibility of the online digital environment. So that's sort of my rough guess at what things are going to look like over the decades ahead. Some of you will be around to see that happen, and I'm sure every one of you will influence it. So whatever you do, don't mess it up. Thanks very much.